The first time my father killed me, it was with a pen, not a bullet, and he did it in a room full of witnesses who applauded when he was finished. My name is Claire, and I learned that night that blood is not the same thing as belonging, no matter how many portraits hang on the walls insisting otherwise. I was born into a house that believed itself immortal, a stone estate older than the country it sat in, a place that had survived wars, depressions, revolutions, and generations of men who mistook endurance for virtue, and from the moment I could walk, I was taught that the family name was not something you owned, it was something you served, something you polished and protected, something that mattered more than truth, more than love, and certainly more than any individual child unfortunate enough to be born with questions. The manor was my playground and my prison, its long corridors lined with ancestors whose eyes followed you not with warmth, but with accounting, tallying whether you were worthy of the frame you would someday occupy, and my father, Arthur, walked those halls like a king who believed the stones themselves owed him allegiance. He used to tell me that our family didn't adapt to history, we absorbed it, that survival was proof of righteousness, and I believed him because children believe the people who feed them stories before they feed them facts. I grew up assuming I would inherit the estate not because I was loved, but because it was efficient, because I was competent, because I understood the ledgers better than the social calendar, and in a family that worshipped appearances, I was tolerated as long as I made the numbers behave. That was my mistake, believing usefulness was protection. I didn't discover my father's secret in a dramatic way. No masked men or midnight phone calls, just a quiet discrepancy in a series of accounts that didn't make sense unless you already suspected rot, and once you suspect rot, you find it everywhere. The estate wasn't surviving on tradition or good management, it was surviving on laundering, on shell foundations and offshore vehicles dressed up as philanthropy. On a slow siphoning of dirty money that kept the roof repaired and the Gala funded and the illusion intact, and I remember sitting alone in the library with its leather-bound lies and realizing that the house wasn't a legacy at all. It was a debt machine wrapped in nostalgia. I confronted him because I still believed confrontation meant resolution, because I hadn't yet learned that powerful men don't correct problems, they remove people. He didn't yell. He didn't deny it. He looked at me the way one looks at a cracked mirror, annoyed not by the damage, but by the inconvenience of reflection, and he told me, calmly, that families like ours sometimes had to make difficult decisions to preserve themselves. That morality was a luxury for people without assets, and then he did something far worse than argue. He reframed me. Within weeks, I was no longer a concerned daughter, I was unstable. The press was briefed quietly. Old friends stopped answering. My name vanished from donor lists and seating charts. A perfect cousin, polished and pliable, was elevated into my place like a replacement part. I was not disinherited, that would have acknowledged my existence. I was expunged, removed from the family tree as if I'd never been born. My bedroom was emptied. My childhood portraits were taken down. My father told the world I had imagined things, that stress had gotten to me, that it was tragic but necessary to distance the family from my episode, and the most terrifying part was how easily everyone accepted it, because reputation, I learned, is just a story told often enough by the right mouth. I left with one suitcase and no inheritance, but what I carried with me was far heavier, the knowledge that the system I had trusted was built on debt and fear, and that knowledge was worth more than any silver service. I went to a city that didn't care who my father was, a place where buildings went up faster than names could stick, and I disappeared the way only truly erased people can, completely and deliberately. And for the first few years I was angry in the way the young are angry, loud, and directionless, but anger without strategy is just noise, and noise is easy to ignore. So I learned instead. I learned how money really moves, how debt is sold like meat, how distress is discounted, how every empire, no matter how old, rests on obligations it prays no one will call due all at once, and I built a company that didn't rescue businesses. It acquired their mistakes. Asset acquisition and distressed debt sounds clean, clinical, but what we really did was wait. We waited for pride to outpace liquidity. We waited for institutions to borrow against the future, and then pretend the bill would never arrive. I became very good at patience. One day, I was in an airport lounge, half awake, scrolling without thinking, when his face appeared on a glossy page propped beside the coffee machine. A magazine profile. A celebration piece. The headline called him the last true steward of a vanishing aristocracy, and beneath it was a photograph taken at a fundraiser, my father smiling softly, hands folded, the estate visible behind him like proof of moral authority. I stood there longer than I should have, reading every word, watching the article praise his discipline, his restraint, his devotion to family, and I felt the old heat rise in my chest. The urge to tear the magazine in half, or call a reporter, or simply scream that none of it was true. For a moment, I imagined walking back into his life then, imagined confronting him while he was still secure, still admired, still convinced I was gone forever. And then I noticed the numbers buried in the piece, the casual references to new loans framed as innovative preservation, the careful language that suggested strain without admitting weakness. I put the magazine back untouched. Airports are full of people rushing toward the wrong exits, and I realized I was exactly where I needed to be. He wasn't ready yet. And neither was the debt. 15 years passed. The world started calling me the Vulture of Wall Street, and I let them, because vultures don't kill. They simply understand timing better than anyone else, and while my father hosted galas beneath chandeliers paid for by borrowed time, I was quietly buying pieces of his downfall from people he didn't even know he owed. I didn't hate him anymore by the time the estate's debt reached its breaking point. Hate is exhausting. I was calm, focused, precise, and when the opportunity finally arrived, I didn't hesitate, because hesitation is just sentimentality pretending to be caution. I bought the debt on the land itself, the soil he believed eternal, and ownership, I learned, is just paperwork filed by the person who understands it best. The invitation to the Heritage Gala arrived as it always did, heavy cardstock, gold lettering, a celebration of endurance, and I attended, not as a guest, but as the future he never planned for. Walking into the house that erased me carrying documents that proved it had never truly belonged to him at all. I walked up the long drive the way you walk toward a courtroom when you already know the verdict, and the house rose out of the dark like it always had, confident and careless, as if stone alone could intimidate time. And the gravel beneath my heels sounded like old bones cracking under pressure, and I kept my breathing even because this was not a reunion, it was a transfer of ownership. The Heritage Gala was a ritual my father treated like a holy day, the annual proof to the world that the family was still intact, still desirable, still worth inviting into the rooms where influence is traded like perfume. And the estate was lit as if it were trying to outshine its own history, windows glowing gold, lanterns lining the path, a string quartet's music drifting out into the winter air like polite fog. At the top of the steps, 2 attendants in black coats were greeting guests by name, smiling with the practiced warmth of staff who understand they are paid to reflect someone else's greatness, and as I approached, one of them stepped forward automatically, hand out for my invitation, and his smile froze when he looked at my face, not because he recognized me, but because he recognized the tension in the air around me, the kind that makes people glance away as if discomfort were contagious. I handed him nothing. I didn't need an invitation. I was no longer an entry on a guest list. I was an entry on a ledger. The doors opened, and heat spilled out, carrying with it the scent of polished wood, expensive perfume, and the faint metallic tang of champagne that has been poured too early and left waiting for lips. I stepped inside and let my eyes adjust to the chandelier's glare, and for a moment, memory tried to do what memory always does, to pull me backward, to show me myself as a child in dress shoes too tight, being reminded to stand straight, to smile softly. To never speak too loudly because loudness suggests a lack of breeding. The foyer looked the same, except it didn't, because nothing looks the same once you know what it costs, not in money, but in silence. The portraits still line the walls, each one framed like a verdict, each ancestor painted with the same confident mouth, the same rigid posture, the same expression that says, "We were right to be here." My father had once told me those paintings were proof of permanence. Now I saw them as inventory. The guests were already flowing through the halls, laughter like soft, clinking glass, and everywhere I looked I saw old money doing what it does best, congratulating itself for surviving. Women in gowns moved like swans with sharpened beaks. Men in tuxedos spoke in low tones, words heavy with implication. The younger ones, hungry and nervous, hovered near the influential like moths near flame, hoping proximity would count as inheritance. I didn't belong to any of them anymore, and that was the most liberating thing I had ever experienced. I moved through them as if I were invisible, because to them I was. My father had made sure of that, and he had done it so thoroughly that even now, as I walked through the heart of his most sacred performance, no one stopped me, no one questioned me. Because no one expects danger to arrive in a calm dress with steady hands. In the ballroom, the ceiling arched high, painted with cherubs and clouds that had watched hundreds of deals made between people who pretended their generosity was purely spiritual. The tables were dressed in linen and crystal. Servers moved with trays like quiet machinery, refilling glasses before emptiness could be noticed. At the far end of the room, on a raised platform, my father stood receiving compliments like tribute, his hair more silver now, his shoulders slightly narrower, but his posture still carved from arrogance. Beside him stood my cousin, the one he had installed in my place, the heir he could control. She was beautiful in the way magazines train people to worship, the kind of beauty that requires obedience, and she smiled at the guests with a face that said nothing sharp was ever allowed to pass her lips. She wore the family jewels around her neck, the same necklace my grandmother had once promised would be mine, and, for a second, something old and hot moved through me, not jealousy, not sadness, but recognition. The clear understanding that what my father had stolen from me was never truly mine anyway, because in that house, nothing belonged to you, not even your name. I watched him for a long moment before I approached, because it's important to see a man in his preferred habitat before you dismantle it. My father was in his element, laughing at jokes that weren't funny, offering nods that felt like blessings, placing a hand on shoulders as if his touch conferred legitimacy. He believed he was safe here. He believed the estate was his fortress. He believed the guest list was a shield. I had once believed those things too. That's why the betrayal had been so devastating. That's why the revenge had to be surgical. I waited until the room reached its peak, that moment when people are most satisfied with themselves, when the photographer is capturing smiles, when the donors are warmed by wine and their own imagined importance. My father raised a glass to begin his annual speech, the speech he gave every year, filled with the same phrases about legacy, stewardship, honor, and the sacred duty of preserving the past. The guests hushed. The quartet softened. The lights seemed to lean in. My father took a breath and I stepped forward. It's strange how a room can change temperature without anyone touching the thermostat. As I moved closer, a few faces turned, curiosity first, then confusion, because I wasn't on anyone's mental guest list, and the human mind hates an unfiled presence. I walked directly toward the platform, not rushing, not hesitating, and my heels clicked against the polished floor like punctuation. My father kept speaking for a beat, the momentum of his rehearsed words carrying him forward even as his eyes flicked toward me, and then his voice faltered, just slightly, the way a violin note breaks when the string is cut. He stared, and in that stare I saw it all, the brief panic, the furious calculation, the reflexive instinct to erase me again, to turn me into a problem he could explain away. But there was nowhere to hide in front of this many witnesses, and the camera flashes made it worse, because a man who has built his power on controlling the story cannot tolerate an unscripted moment. "Arthur," I said, not loudly, just clearly, and the simple act of speaking his name felt like stepping on sacred ground with muddy shoes. "Good evening." A ripple moved through the crowd. People leaned toward one another, trying to identify me, trying to decide whether recognition would be embarrassing. My father's mouth tightened. He recovered quickly, because men like him are trained for recovery. Their entire lives are built on it. He smiled, the public smile, the charming patriarch smile. Claire, he said, and I almost laughed because hearing him say my name out loud after so many years felt like a confession he didn't realize he was making. What a surprise. He had to say it like that. Surprise. Not welcome. Not you're alive. Not what are you doing here. Surprise suggests a social oddity, not a moral reckoning. Surprise keeps the moment light. Surprise gives him room to maneuver. You remember me, I said, and I saw my cousin's eyes flicker, sharp and wary now, because she understood what the guests did not, that my presence threatened the stability of her position, that an heir is only safe as long as the previous one stays dead. Of course I remember you, my father said smoothly. I heard you've been unwell. There it was, the old narrative, his favorite weapon, the quiet insinuation that nothing I said could be trusted because my mind was the problem, and I felt something settle inside me, not anger, but certainty. He was still the same man. He hadn't grown. He hadn't softened. He hadn't regretted anything. He had simply aged. I've been very well, I said. Better than I've ever been. My father's smile held, but his eyes narrowed. And what brings you here tonight? I could feel the room listening now. Guests held their glasses a little too still. Servers slowed. Even the quartet seemed to hesitate, unsure whether to keep playing. My father did not want a scene, not here, not tonight, not on his stage. I wanted it. I wanted the moment to become a fracture line in the story he had spent decades polishing. I'm here about the estate, I said. My father's jaw tightened again, just for a second. The estate is not a topic for public discussion? I finished for him. I agree. That's why I tried to address it privately 15 years ago. A few heads turned sharply at that. A few brows lifted. My father's eyes flashed warning, the old silent command, the one that had once made me shrink. It didn't work anymore. He leaned slightly toward me, lowering his voice, attempting intimacy, attempting control. Claire, he murmured, this is not the place. It is exactly the place, I said at the same volume I'd used the entire time, because the trick of power is to make you whisper while they speak. This is where you built your reputation. This is where you buried me. This is where you invited everyone who ever mattered to you, and you did it in my house. His smile cracked at that. Your house, he repeated, too quickly, too sharply, and the guests caught the change. People don't always understand words, but they understand tone. They understand a man being challenged. I reached into my clutch, slowly, deliberately, the way you might reach for a match in a room full of dry paper. I pulled out a neat folder of documents, thick enough to feel heavy even from a distance. I didn't wave them. I didn't hold them high. I simply held them out toward him like a gift he didn't want. These are the eviction papers, I said. There was a sound then, not loud, but collective, a soft intake of breath, the way a crowd reacts to a fall they didn't expect to see. My father didn't take the folder at first. His eyes locked on it as if it were a snake. My cousin's face went pale. Someone in the front row actually laughed, a nervous little burst, then stopped when they realized no one else was laughing. This is nonsense, my father said, but his voice had lost its smoothness. You can't. I can, I said. And I did. He finally took the folder, fingers stiff. He flipped it open, scanning the first page, and I watched his face change, watched the color drain, watched the muscles around his mouth tighten as if he were trying to hold his expression together by force. He looked up at me, and for the first time since this began, his eyes held something real. Fear. Not fear of me as a person. Fear of what I represented. A loss of narrative control. A crack in the brand. Where did you get this? He demanded, voice low. I bought it, I said. Like you bought everything else. He glanced down again, reading, calculating, searching for loopholes. This isn't possible, he said, and the words were almost pleading now, as if reality might bend if he insisted hard enough. The estate is protected. It's collateral, I said. It has been for a long time. I turned slightly so my voice carried beyond him, beyond the platform, into the listening crowd. You've been borrowing against it for years. Quietly. Creatively. You called it preservation. The banks called it risk. And when they were ready to collect, I bought the note. My father's eyes flicked to the crowd, realizing too late that he was exposed, not just to me, but to the people whose respect he had paid for with lies. The guests began to murmur, low and fast. A few looked embarrassed, as if they'd attended a party that suddenly revealed itself to be built on fraud. A few looked thrilled, because scandal is entertainment when you're not the one bleeding. "This is a private family matter," my father said loudly, trying to reclaim the room. "It stopped being private when you used the press to erase me," I said. "It stopped being family when you told the world I was mentally unstable because I discovered your laundering." The word laundering hit the room like a thrown glass. The murmurs sharpened. A woman near the front covered her mouth with her hand. A man whispered urgently to his wife. My father's face went rigid. "You have no proof," he said, voice tight. "I have 15 years of proof," I said. "And I don't need to show it to them. I only needed to show it to the people who sell debt." My cousin finally spoke, her voice trembling but careful, like someone trying to keep a vase from falling. "Claire, please," she said, and I looked at her, really looked, and I saw what she was. Not evil, not innocent, just convenient. She had accepted my place because the family offered her status, and she had probably told herself it was deserved, that I had been unwell, that my father wouldn't lie about something so serious. People accept lies easily when the lie comes with jewelry. "You should step down," I told her softly. "This isn't your house." Her eyes filled with tears. She shook her head once, helplessly, and I almost felt sorry, almost, but pity is a luxury you can't afford when you're undoing a dynasty. My father raised a hand, a command, and 2 security staff began moving toward me, as if muscle could solve what paperwork had already settled. I didn't move. I didn't flinch. I simply waited until they were close enough to see my face clearly, and then I said, "Before you touch me, I suggest you read page 3. The clause about interference." The security staff hesitated, glancing at my father. He didn't want to read page 3 in front of everyone. He didn't want to admit he was cornered. He stood frozen for a moment, trapped between image and reality. I leaned in slightly, just enough that only he could hear me, and I spoke with the gentleness of a knife sliding in. "You taught me the family name was a brand," I whispered. "Brands don't survive scandals, father. Not the kind that come with documents." His nostrils flared. "What do you want?" he hissed. I straightened and spoke clearly again, for the room. "I want what's mine." His laugh was harsh and disbelieving. "You were expunged," he said, and the moment the word left his mouth, I saw him realize what he'd done, because he had said it out loud, confessed it, revealed the cruelty he usually hid behind euphemisms. A few guests stared at him in shock. A few looked away, suddenly ashamed. "Yes," I said. "And you did it to protect the estate." I took a breath, and the room felt like it was holding its breath with me. But the estate was never protected. It was mortgaged. It was traded. It was used as a laundromat for money you didn't want traced to your hands. You didn't preserve the legacy. You pawned it. My father's face contorted, rage fighting panic. "You can't do this," he said again, but the sentence sounded smaller now, like a child arguing with a tide. "I already did," I said. "And tonight is your notice." One of the photographers raised his camera, and the flash popped, bright as a gunshot. My father flinched. The crowd murmured louder. I could see phones coming out now, discreet at first, then less so, because discretion weakens in the presence of a good story. My father stepped toward me, lowering his voice again, desperate for private leverage. "Claire," he said, "you're making a mistake. This house is bigger than you." I looked him in the eyes and felt nothing but clarity. "No," I said. "This house was always smaller than me. You just never wanted to admit it." Then I did the thing that truly broke him. I smiled. It wasn't a cruel smile. It wasn't triumphant. It was calm, almost tender, like someone who has finally stopped arguing with a man who cannot change. "You told the world I wasn't a member of this family," I said. "I finally agreed with you." My father's throat worked as if he were swallowing glass. "You wouldn't," he said, and in that moment I realized he still believed, deep down, that I would crave his approval enough to spare him, that the bloodline spell would work, that I would kneel before tradition the way he had trained me to kneel. "That's the thing about being erased," I said. "It makes you very free." I turned away from him, away from the platform, and began to walk through the room again, not rushing, not fleeing, just moving, and the crowd parted instinctively, unsure whether to stop me, unsure whether stopping me would make them complicit. Behind me, my father barked orders, his voice too loud, too sharp, the sound of a man watching his stage collapse. Someone asked him a question. Someone else laughed. My cousin sobbed softly. The music tried to restart, the quartet scrambling to fill the silence, but the notes sounded wrong now, frantic, like a lullaby played at a funeral. As I passed the portraits in the hall, I looked at them again, and I saw the truth behind every painted face. They weren't watching me with judgment. They were watching with helplessness, because history is only powerful as long as people agree to preserve it, and I had decided not to. Outside, the cold air hit my skin and cleared my mind. The estate glowed behind me, still beautiful, still imposing, still pretending to be eternal. But beauty is not ownership. Stone is not immunity. And that night, for the first time in 15 years, I felt the weight of the family name slide off my shoulders like a cloak I hadn't realized I was still wearing. The gala would become a headline by morning. The donors would whisper. The banks would call. The board of every foundation my father hid behind would suddenly find itself audited. The brand would fracture. But that was only the beginning. The eviction papers were just the first cut. The real ruin was what I planned to do next, because my father didn't just take my inheritance, he tried to take my existence, and if he wanted a world where I did not belong, I would give him one where nothing he built could remain whole. The lawyers arrived before dawn, because fear wakes people earlier than loyalty ever does, and by the time the sun crept over the hedges that had been trimmed by generations of hands paid to pretend permanence was natural. The house was no longer a home, but a site, a location tagged and logged, its fate decided by signatures already dry. I didn't sleep that night. I never do when something irreversible has begun. Sleep is for people who still believe they might change their minds. I stood in the guest house across the drive, the one my father used to reserve for important visitors, and watched lights flick on and off inside the manor as staff whispered and packed and cried quietly into linen that had outlived marriages. There is a specific sound a house makes when it realizes it is no longer loved. It creaks differently. It exhales. By mid-morning, my father requested a meeting. The message came through his attorney, formal, restrained, pretending this was a negotiation rather than a post-mortem, and I agreed, because power isn't just about winning. It's about being willing to sit across from someone who has nothing left to offer you and still listen. We met in the library, of course, the room where I had first understood what he was doing, the room he believed gave him authority simply by existing. The shelves were still lined with books no one read, histories curated to flatter the family narrative, and the long table between us was polished to a reflective sheen so that when he looked down, he could see his own face distorted back at him. He looked older in daylight, smaller, the illusion of the gala stripped away, and for the first time I noticed how tired he was, how much effort it took to keep pretending the world owed him continuity. "You don't have to do this," he said, without preamble, because men like him skip apologies the way they skip accountability, and his voice was hoarse, as if he had been arguing with reality all night. "The house can stay in the family." "It already isn't," I said, and the simplicity of that fact seemed to wound him more than anger ever could. "You could sell it back to me," he pressed. "Name your price." I smiled then, not because it was funny, but because it was inevitable. "You taught me better than that," I said. "You taught me that price is what you pay when you can't control the outcome." He leaned forward, hands gripping the edge of the table. "Think about the name," he said, and there it was, the last refuge, the bloodline argument, dragged out like a relic. "Think about what this does to us." I met his gaze steadily. "You already did this to us," I said. "You just expected me to disappear quietly." He shook his head, frustration leaking through his composure. "You're destroying 200 years of history." "No," I said. "I'm liquidating it." The words seemed to hit him physically. He flinched, as if I'd struck him, and I realized then that what he loved was not the people, not even the power, but the illusion of continuity, the idea that he was a steward rather than a gambler. I told him what would happen next, calmly, methodically, because clarity is a kindness he never gave me. The contents of the house would be catalogued and sold. Every portrait, every piece of silver, every manuscript and relic would be dispersed to collectors and museums around the world. The family library would be broken apart, its volumes scattered so the story could never be reassembled into a single flattering narrative again. The land would be rezoned. The permits were already signed. The manor would come down stone by stone, not because it was inefficient, but because it was symbolic, and symbols only hold power as long as people agree to protect them. He stared at me as if I were speaking a foreign language. "You wouldn't dare," he said, and I could hear the boy he once was in his voice, the one who had been taught that some things were untouchable. "I already dared," I said. "You just never imagined I'd be the one with the authority." He stood abruptly, chair scraping against the floor. "I am your father," he said, louder now, the old command returning out of habit. "You have a duty." I rose too, not mirroring his anger, just matching his height. "You told the world I wasn't your daughter," I said. "You don't get to claim me now that you need something." For a moment, I thought he might cry. His face twisted, not with remorse, but with loss of control, and that was when I knew there would be no reconciliation, not because I refused it, but because he had never understood what it required. He left the room without another word, his footsteps echoing down the hall like a retreat disguised as dignity. The rest unfolded quickly. News moved faster than stone ever could. Articles appeared questioning the estate's finances, donors distanced themselves, boards resigned preemptively, and the cousin who had worn my necklace issued a statement about being misled, about having no knowledge of wrongdoing, about stepping away for personal reasons. I didn't contact her. She was collateral, not a target, and I had learned long ago not to confuse the two. The auctions were scheduled. Experts arrived to appraise what my family had hoarded for centuries, reducing heirlooms to estimates, translating sentiment into numbers that fit neatly on a page. I watched a portrait of my great-great-grandfather, the man whose name adorned half the estate's wings, get wrapped in plastic like freight, and I felt lighter with every object that left the house, as if history itself were finally exhaling. On the day demolition was approved, my father sent one final message. No lawyers this time. Just him. It was short. He asked me to meet him once more, alone, for the sake of the bloodline. I agreed, because endings deserve witnesses. We stood on the lawn where family photographs had been staged for generations, the manor looming behind us, already marked with surveyors' flags, and he looked at the house the way some men look at a dying spouse, not with love, but with terror of being alone. "Please," he said, and it was the first time I had ever heard him say the word without expectation attached. "Don't do this." I looked at him, really looked, and I saw a man who had built a life on the belief that legacy was something you could own, something you could weaponize, something that would forgive you anything as long as you kept feeding it. And I understood then that my final act wasn't about revenge at all. It was about agreement. "You told the world I wasn't a member of this family, Father," I said, my voice steady, the wind carrying my words away from the house that no longer deserved them. "I finally agreed with you. And since I'm not a member, I have no reason to value your junk." The machines would arrive the following week. The estate would become data, servers humming where chandeliers once glowed, the past flattened into something useful, impersonal, and entirely uninterested in lineage. I walked away without looking back, because the past had already taken enough of my attention, and for the first time since I had been erased, I felt something like peace, not the quiet kind, but the solid kind. The kind that comes from knowing the story cannot be rewritten again. The week before demolition felt strangely calm, the way oceans do before a storm everyone else insists is impossible, and I spent those days doing something my father never understood how to do, which was nothing. I didn't call reporters. I didn't issue statements. I didn't correct the narratives that sprang up like weeds in the absence of his carefully curated silence. I let the truth move the way truth always does when it's finally unblocked, unevenly, noisily, with consequences no one can fully predict. The house emptied itself faster than I expected. Staff accepted severance with the careful gratitude of people who know loyalty has an expiration date. Movers cataloged and removed the remaining artifacts with clinical efficiency. Each item left a pale outline behind, a ghost mark on wood or plaster, proof that history is not immortal, it just leaves stains. I walked the halls one last time alone, not to mourn, but to confirm my own detachment, and it surprised me how little I felt. There was no surge of triumph, no echo of childhood grief. Just a quiet acknowledgement that the place had already been dead long before I ever bought its debt, that my father had been preserving a shell and calling it a soul. On the morning the machines arrived, the sky was low and gray, the kind of color people romanticize when they don't have to stand under it. I arrived early, before the crew, before the onlookers who would inevitably gather, because ruins attract spectators the way success attracts parasites. I stood at the edge of the lawn and watched the house breathe its last version of itself, windows boarded now, doors sealed, the facade stripped of hospitality. My father was not there. He had left days earlier, retreating to some secondary property, some lesser stronghold where the name might still open doors for a while longer. He did not call. He did not write. Men like him do not process endings well unless they are in control of them, and this ending had never belonged to him. The first impact was almost anticlimactic. Stone gives way with a sound more like surrender than violence, and as the structure cracked and folded, something inside me loosened, not because I enjoyed the destruction, but because it finalized what words never could. You can argue with documents. You can spin stories. You cannot negotiate with absence. When the dust rose, thick and pale, it erased the silhouette my family had spent 2 centuries worshipping, and I realized then that legacy is not what survives, it's what you refuse to dismantle, and I had refused nothing. I stayed until the roof collapsed inward, until the shape that had defined my childhood no longer existed as a shape at all, and then I left, because staying longer would have been indulgent. The data center rose quickly. Steel and glass replaced stone and wood. Servers hummed where ballrooms once echoed with flattery. No portraits lined the walls. No names were carved into anything. It was efficient, anonymous, and brutally honest about its purpose. People worked there who had no idea whose house had stood on that land before, and that anonymity felt like justice. I kept my company. I kept my distance. I built something that did not require a bloodline to justify its existence. Occasionally, someone would recognize my name, connect it to an article, a scandal, a rumor, and they would ask if it was true, if I really demolished my own family estate, if I really erased 200 years of history. And I would answer them the same way every time, calmly, without drama. I didn't erase history. I stopped pretending it was sacred. Years later, I heard my father died quietly, not disgraced enough to be remembered as a villain, not honored enough to be remembered as a patriarch, just another man whose name lingered briefly in obituaries before being replaced by the next story. There was no reconciliation. There was no final letter. There was no apology. And strangely, that felt right. Closure, I learned, does not require symmetry. It requires honesty. I was never his legacy. I was his consequence. My name is Claire, and I was erased once by a man who believed family was a brand and daughters were expendable when they threatened the balance sheet. I built my life in the space his cruelty created, and when the time came, I agreed with him completely. I did not belong to his world, and because of that, I owed it nothing. If this story kept you listening, if it helped you unwind or reminded you that power doesn't always belong to the loudest voice in the room, take a moment to like and subscribe. More stories are waiting, and sometimes the quiet ones are the most satisfying.